Well, good day everybody. We come to our last lecture, lecture 12, and this one's on the resurrection itself, John chapters 20 and 21. We'd like to do three things in our time together today. The first is I'd like to look at the resurrection itself a little bit, in the sense of why it's so central to our faith and how the Gospel writers talk to us about the resurrection, how they present it to us. Second thing I'd like to do is to look at John chapter 20, which in many ways, of course, is the final word of St. John to us. It's a series of encounters with different people with the Lord: Simon Peter and the beloved disciple, Mary of Magdala, the disciples themselves, and then Thomas. And finally, the third thing was John chapter 21, which is sort of like the epilogue. Many scholars, most scholars in fact, would say that that's added to our scriptures from another Johannine source, perhaps the editor of the whole work, but its message still makes sense within the context of the whole gospel. The first section will look at the miraculous catch of fish at the lake of Tiberias in Galilee, the lake of Galilee. And the second will look at Jesus and what he says to the beloved disciple and to Peter. Okay, the first section now, which is a little bit of a broad look at the resurrection itself. And as you can see, we have a picture here for you, and it's from a wonderful 15th century painter, artist, Piero della Francesca. And this is his famous Resurrection. And you can see it's of Jesus standing triumphant, a Renaissance man really, there, and the guards are asleep at the foot of the tomb. And that's how we Westerners picture the resurrection. Of course, there's no picture in the Gospels about what took place, how it took place, or anything like that. But how we picture it is Jesus coming forth like that. And from Matthew's Gospel, we have a sense of the guards being asleep. We know that the Lord's resurrection is central to us and our faith as Christians. It was belief in the Lord's resurrection which transformed those frightened disciples into confident apostles. They left the security of the upper room, especially once the Spirit empowered them, and went down into the marketplace and preached Christ risen. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, said St. Paul, and your faith is in vain. Sunday, the Lord's Day, is the original feast day, the original celebration for us Christians. And it's the day, of course, when we celebrate the resurrection, the Lord's resurrection from the dead. Sometime during the course of that first century, probably in the second or third generation of Christians, we actually changed the day we worship God from the Sabbath, Saturday, to Sunday, the Lord's Day. And we renamed Sunday as the Lord's Day. And we can find that also in the writings of St. John in the book of Revelation in the first chapter. We call the Lord's death and resurrection the mystery of our faith. Let's proclaim the mystery of faith at every Mass. Christ has died, Christ is risen, and Christ will come again. The earliest preaching we have of what the apostles said when they went out from the upper room into the marketplace comes to us from the Acts of the Apostles. Within the Acts of the Apostles, of course, written by Luke in the 80s, there's little bits and pieces that go, we think, right back to the earliest preaching. And so, we can go back to what St. Peter says a couple of times. For example, in chapter 2, verses 23 and the following of the Acts of the Apostles. And this is what the preaching of Peter is. You are the Israelites. Listen to what I have to say. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with deeds and powers and wonders. This man, handed over to you according to the definite plan of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of those outside the law. But God raised him up, having freed him from death. You crucified him, God raised him up. That's the heart of the earliest message, the earliest proclamation of the early Christians, of Peter and the first disciples. Once we get to St. Paul, another 20 years later from that, in the 50s AD, before the Gospels again, of course, the message is slightly added to, in a sense. Christ died and was buried, and then Christ was raised and he appeared to some of the disciples, etc. So a little bit more. And then of course the Gospels emerge another 10 to 15 years later or so. We have Mark, especially the chapter 16 verses 1 to 8. We think that after verse 8, verses 9 to 16, that's a much later addition to Mark's Gospel. So the earliest Gospel account is Mark chapters 1 to 8. And then later still, another 15 years or so later, comes Luke chapter 24, Matthew 28, and Mark's longer ending, Mark 16, 9 to 20. And then of course comes John chapter 20, and later still John chapter 21. So we have 6 accounts from the Gospel of the Lord's resurrection. All the Gospel writers tell us that the disciples saw the same Jesus who had been crucified, and yet the risen Jesus is somehow different from what he was before he died. Somehow unrecognizable, somehow transformed. He was visible, yet he seemed like a ghost. His body had the marks of the Passion, and yet he suddenly appears and disappears through doors and walls and whatever. He shares a meal with his disciples, and yet they struggle. Is it really him? Yes, it is. And so on. Now, it's hard to explain what the Gospel writers are trying to tell us through all that. No one was present, of course, at the Lord's resurrection, and no Gospel writer ever tries to describe what happened. Over the years, you've had people who don't believe it try to explain it away. Jesus was drugged. He really didn't die on a cross. The apostles stole the body